So we are here on February 18th for the Marine Clean Energy Board of Directors meetings, and we're going to start out with the swearing in of our new representative from the city of Mill Valley, Sashi McAtee. So Dawn, you want to do the honors?
So, Director McKenzie, you can stand up and raise your hand and repeat after me. I, Sashi McKenzie, do solemnly swear or affirm.
I, Sashi McEntee, do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
Of the state of California.
of the state of California
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
That I will bear true faith and allegiance.
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
To the Constitution of the United States.
to the Constitution of the United States
And the Constitution of the state of California.
and the Constitution of the state of California,
That I take this obligation freely.
that I take this obligation freely
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
And that I will well and faithfully
and that I will well and faithfully
discharge
discharge the duties
upon which I am about to enter.
upon which I'm about to enter.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Welcome,
to the board.
Sashi. It's one of the most challenging parts of taking office because everybody breaks the oath up a little bit differently.
That's
So you
right.
can't, and you have to keep taking it over and over and over again. So great. All right, welcome aboard, Sashi.
Thank you.
Next is board announcements. Anybody? Barbara?
Is this board director's comments, or is that at the
You can
end?
you can view it that way if you'd like to.
Okay, just a quick one. I learned of a program that SMUD has for energy efficiency, whereby in disadvantaged communities, they actually install energy efficiency measures. And so I'm wondering if maybe in the future, I know our application's pending, that we could look at something like that, maybe for certain areas of Richmond or some of our other areas where we have people that own homes and have, disadvantaged communities, because as we know, existing buildings are really huge contributors to greenhouse gases. So maybe we can look into this MUD program. And I think our program's great, but I just learned about this and I thought that would be a nice compliment in the future.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up. We have some knowledge of the SMUD program and have used SMUD not just for our energy efficiency programs, but in other areas as a great example for us. We actually do have a focus on low-income service on our EE programs through the multifamily program and also through a separate application that we have going on the low-income front. It's great. What they're doing at SMUD is great, and we absolutely are watching them closely.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other directors? Mayor Tom, please.
Dawn, are you going to say something about Portland?
Happy to. Although, why don't
You are.
Why don't you go first?
go ahead?
Okay, so Dawn and I were part of a presentation in Portland last week at the New Partners for Smart Growth Conference, and it was basically about Solar One. So we talked about that project and its context, and Dawn talked about the MCE part of it, and there were a lot of questions. It was quite a bit of interest, so I think it was well received.
And I think the part that really stood out to me the most in the presentation was the excellent work of Richmond Build and the work that the city of Richmond has done to make that program so robust and successful, and it was really great to have them part of our panel.
Terrific. Thank you, Tom. Any other directors' matters? Okay, seeing none, it's now time for public open time for items not on our agenda. Is there anyone who'd like to speak?
I'll be a public.
You're a public. Come on up to the microphone. Good evening.
Good evening. Is this working, or I don't know?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me? All right. My name is Jim Bitter. I live in Mill Valley. I've been following this for a long time. I'm a native of Marin County. I think I was born down the street. 2 days ago, I was in Corte Madera, and one of their agenda items was their climate action plan. And I was thinking that I don't think there's anybody in Corte Madera who knows what a climate action plan is. That item that got on the agenda was not because the residents of Port Madera wanted that thing on the agenda. I don't think there was a room full of letters or emails. And I think I spoke at the end about the city council getting together with the public, and I suggested that maybe they should put on a workshop, and that the 5 of them or 2 of them talk to the public about what a climate action plan is, and the history and where it came from. And then it occurred to me that in 2009, 2010, in the Mill Valley City Council chambers, there was an agenda item about community choice aggregation. That item got on the city council agenda item, not because the people in Mill Valley wanted community choice aggregation. They didn't, I don't think there was letters about we want to form Ring Clean Energy, Ring Energy Authority. And I think that the time has come when I think it would be helpful if every member of a city council in Marin put on their own workshop by themselves for as long as it took to explain what community choice aggregation is. You know, AB 117, I think it was Carol Migden. How that starts. So my second thought tonight was reading the paper. The Marin Municipal Water District, those reservoirs are in Marin, the pipes are in Marin, the pumps are in Marin, the board of directors meets in Marin. It's a Marin County Joint Powers Authority to deliver water to the residents. Now I'm looking at Ring Clean Energy, and you're gonna have, I think you need another agenda item here, that the name no longer works. How can you call it Marin Clean Energy when now it's Richmond, San Pablo, and I've been to Walnut Creek. That's a long way off. They're not really related to Marin. What is going on here? So I think if you put on a workshop, explain the Marin thing, then you get to energy, power, electricity, deep green, light green. What is power? What is energy? What is electricity? What are people buying? In consideration of 1/3 of what I pay for electrical generation, in consideration of that, what do I get? When I go to Safeway, I buy a quart of milk, 2%. I give them, how much is it? My wife buys it. And I bring it home and I open it, I have 1 quart of 2% milk. I look at my PG&E bill, 1/3 of what I pay for generation is going to buy what? I think the time has come when every member on a city council that is representing the residents of your city should be able to explain this thing about the energy, the power, what are you buying, and why we are doing this. And
Thanks, Jim. Can you wrap up?
I think I've wrapped it.
Okay.
I think the time has come when you go by yourself, but you don't take the staff, you don't take the consultants, and explain what energy is, what electricity is. You don't use the Charleston Flash and Lake in the Sky or electrons. You drop one in here and take one out here, because that's not the way electrical engineering work describes the grid.
Great. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you for your time.
We got it. Thank you very much. All right. Anyone else from the public want to speak? Seeing none, it's now time for the report from our Chief Executive Officer, Dawn.
Great. I have a few items this evening. Just a reminder, if you can, to identify yourself by name when you're speaking, when you start speaking into the microphone. That helps with our minutes being accurate. Also, just a reminder that as we're attempting to continue to have paperless meetings to the extent possible, we'll have limited copies of the PowerPoints available upon request. So if you would like to have a hard copy, just let us know. We have a few here. And let us know if you're having any trouble getting access to the material on your iPad. We're happy to help with that. If you need hard copies as a last resort, let us know in advance, and we'll do what we can on that front. Next, I wanted to let folks know kind of an update on where we are with new communities and their interest level in as we're getting close to the March 31st deadline. We've had a bit of activity I wanted to report on. So in Contra Costa County, 3 communities have completed the first reading of the ordinance to join MCE. Lafayette did their first reading on January 25th, the city of Oakley on February 9th, and then Walnut Creek this week on February 16th. Have completed their first reading. We also have a scheduled first reading next week on February 24th in Moraga. And then Yountville will be the fifth of the 4 cities in Napa that are interested in joining. Yountville has scheduled their first reading for March 1st. And then I wanted to give a quick update on
Dawn,
energy
can I stop you for a second, Dawn, because there was just the article in the IJ about all the interest in MCE, and I think that article made it sound as if as soon as a city adopted an ordinance, they were part of MCE, and I think it might be helpful if you just remind everybody what the process is.
Absolutely, yeah. So of course the first reading is the first step that needs to happen at a city or a county. And then a second reading, of course, needs to occur. That's the extent of the action that's required by the cities that are interested in joining. However, there is action that is required on our side. So at the conclusion of the deadline, March 31st, which will be the end of the invitation period that we have open right now, we will need to conduct an economic analysis to determine if the cities that have requested membership would be a net benefit to us, budget-wise and rate-wise. So we'll need to request data from PG&E. After receiving that data, we'll need to conduct an analysis, and then we'll be presenting that information to the board. It'll probably initially be presented at the committee level and then to the full board, potentially as early as April, but not anytime sooner than that. And then we'll be determining whether to move forward with accepting these cities that are requesting membership currently.
Thank you.
The next item I wanted to report on is energy efficiency. We had 2 workshops since our last board meeting on January 28th and February 4th. We held workshops on our energy efficiency application to the CPUC, and these meetings were really well attended. They included participants from ABAG, the Office of Ratepayer Advocates, or ORA, PG&E representatives attended, and CPUC representatives attended, as well as representatives from many of the local government partnerships that run energy efficiency programs under PG&E in many of our member counties. So these were successful. Also, there was a pre-hearing conference held on February 1st at the CPUC to discuss our energy efficiency proposal, which is the $80 million proposal that was submitted late last year. And good progress was made at this pre-conference hearing. We expect to see more developments in the coming months, and we will have an energy efficiency update at our next board meeting. The next item I wanted to report on is that we have submitted an application to ABAG and to the Transportation Authority of Marin to fund the installation of 5 electric vehicle chargers at the MCE parking lot. We have our application to the Transportation Authority of Marin has already been approved. So we will be receiving $12,000 to go towards the installation of electric vehicle charging stations in our parking lot. Our request to ABAG should be responded to within the next 2 months, and that's a $60,000 request. So we'll let you know once we have news on that. The last 2 items, I just wanted to let folks know about upcoming events. So in our technical committee meeting on March 7th, we're going to have a presentation from the Marin Carbon Project. And this is kind of, we've been working to do a bit of cross-pollination.
I'm sorry, Dawn, could you say it again? I just couldn't hear what you just said.
Yeah, the Marin Carbon Project. We're doing some cross-pollinating between counties and cities that are part of our service area. We heard at our retreat, we heard some really interesting activity that's happening in Benicia as far as water conservation. There's a lot of exciting programmatic stuff happening in many of our service areas, and the Marin Carbon Project is one that I think folks will be really interested in. It's a strategy for carbon mitigation, and so we encourage folks to attend. Even if you're not on the technical committee, you're welcome to attend. So wanted to put a pitch out for that. And then the next upcoming event I wanted to make sure folks were aware of, on March 17th, which is our next board meeting, we're going to have a soft launch for the Energy Efficiency Demonstration Room, which is going to be in that room right there. We'll be dedicating the room to Barbara George, a longtime energy efficiency advocate in our community. We're going to have Cynthia Mischel from Turn reading some words about Barbara George. George, and also Lou Tremaine, our founding board member from Fairfax, will be coming to say a few words about Barbara George. And so y'all will be hearing more about that, but just wanted to let you know we'll likely be inviting folks to show up just a little bit early for next month's meeting to dedicate that room. And that's it for my report.
That's great. Thank you, Dawn. Any questions for Dawn? Yes, please, Kevin.
Dawn, can I just ask you to comment a little bit on the evolution of the organization's name and the branding that we've used over the years to reflect how, in fact, our scope has grown and the naming has changed to reflect that?
Yeah, happy to. So shortly after the enrollment of customers in Richmond, we spent some time looking at the name. And we spent some time looking at whether we wanted to make a complete change to the name, MCE or Marine Clean Energy, and we actually used a marketing firm to provide some consulting services to us. And they're actually, I'm sorry, but I'm remembering now we actually had them engaged before we began doing enrollment in Richmond. And one of the things that kind of came out of that discussion and analysis was the shift to using MCE as the brand when we were marketing in new communities. But at that time, it was determined that we weren't at a point where we wanted to do a complete name change because we were still a relatively new brand, even in the Marin region. And as customers were just getting to know us, we felt like changing the name at that point wouldn't be fair. I think that there may come a time in the future where we want to revisit that discussion in light of the growth that we're seeing in other communities. Ideally, it would be great to find a replacement word that started with an M. So the MCE brand wasn't going to have to change completely. The word municipal has been tossed around, but it's not a very friendly term. So all ideas are welcome. There's no discussion underway about changing the name at this point, but it's certainly something that we could discuss in the future if there's interest at the board level.
But I get the takeaway I get from that is that as an organization, we're very conscious of the need to be, responsive to the larger group of communities that we're now representing, and to have that reflected in our branding strategy.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the other area where it becomes important is when we're having conversations at the CPUC or in Sacramento. The name makes it appear that we're only representing a small subset of California. And so there could be some advantages and some more transparency afforded by making a change.
Thank you.
I thought too that the reason whether we put the My Community, My Choice underneath it was the M and the C could look like My Community Energy.
Yeah.
My clean energy.
Or My Clean Energy,
Okay.
so I thought that was one of the reasons we did that, to kind of make it look that way.
You're right. Thank you
Yeah.
for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Mhm. All right. Any other questions, comments for Dawn? All right, seeing none, next on our agenda is our consent calendar. We have 4 items. Is there any item that any board member would like to comment on or discuss? Seeing none, would someone like to make a motion to approve the consent calendar?
I'll move it.
I have a second.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposition? Any abstentions?
I need to abstain from C1.
Okay. Any other abstentions? Right, very good, thank you. On to item 6, which are our proposed budgets for fiscal years 16 and 17. David, good evening.
We're not.
Yikes, we're not going to have to read that, right?
So much clearer now.
What you call it, trying to
Good evening.
I'm the finance project manager at MCE, and I'm pleased to present the fiscal 2016-2017 budget to the board this evening. And it has been, and no, you don't need to look at these.
I was going to say, is there anything we can do with lights that might help?
Yeah,
But-
no, it's okay.
yeah,
Actually,
okay.
I threw this up just to sort of, this is the budget, the operating budget in its entirety. I have subsequent slides that go into it in greater detail, so you don't need to squint into the abyss. The budget was approved by the executive committee at its last meeting. And it's going to be presented tonight and approved tonight, and then it will be a public period for the public to review it, and then it'll come back to the board at next month's meeting. So I wanted to begin by pointing out some changes to the presentation of the budget that we've implemented this year, and that's the purpose of this slide here. So first of all, here you see projected 2016 results. In the past, what we've done is we've presented the previous year's budget and compared the previous year's budget with the current year's proposed budget. That's a useful exercise, but it begs the question, well, how does next year compare to what happened this year? So this presentation answers that question, and we'll review how we think we're going to finish 2016 as we go through the proposed 2017 budget. The other thing that we've done is we've broken out energy revenue and then energy expenses and then net energy revenue. So you can see here that we're projecting net energy revenue of 16 million. And we have some internal discussion about, are we a $145 million organization or are we a $16 million organization? In other words, should we be thinking about it in terms of the total? And the answer is we're both. We can only fund our operating expenses based on our net energy revenues. And so breaking it out in this way is hopefully useful to the board and better understanding the composition of revenues and expenses in MCE. The other thing I want to highlight here, down here, is that we've broken out in the budget, really for information purposes, the change in net position. And I'm going to explain more about this in a moment, that will expect to result from the approval of the budget. And I'm going to move to the next slide to explain that a little bit better. So this is the 2015 statement of net position of MCE. So this is our, what many of you might know as a balance sheet. This was March 31st, 2015. And here you can see, here we have assets, liabilities. The difference between the assets and the liabilities is the net position of the organization. So we've got, at the end of last year, 13 million is our net position. So what we essentially began this year with. So if I can go back. So, no, I'm going to go forward instead. This is a blow up of what I was showing before. So now we can see here, here's our net position. There's the 13 million. So we got 2016, this is how we began net position, beginning of period, 13 million. We're going to add 12 million this year. And so we're going to finish, we expect to finish this year with 25 million. We come to 2017, we start the year with 25, see it's the same number, and we're going to add 6. So by the end of the year, we're going to come to 31. This is now information that's sort of available to you in the budget. The other thing that we've done in the past is we've presented the expenditures of the organization. There's an important distinction between expenditures and expenses. The expenditures include a bunch of stuff that are not expenses, and that includes investments in capital. It includes borrowing, so we all know that borrowing is money coming into an organization, but it's not revenue. And similarly, the repayment of debt is money going out of the organization. It's an expenditure, but it's not an expense. So it's very important to understand the distinction between expenditures and expenses. And so what I've done is essentially just pushed all the non-expense expenditures down to the bottom of the budget so that they're clearly distinguished from expenses. Okay, so that's the summary of the changes. I hope they're helpful. Energy revenue, and by the way, in your board pack you have the budget. We present 4 budgets: operating budget, energy efficiency budget, and then 2 budgets which we'll come to relating to renewable energy projects. So there in the notes are some detail about and explanations for the changes in the 2016 compared to what we're projecting for 2017, and you're welcome to review those and pose questions as need be. So I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, and if anyone has any questions as I do so, please go ahead and ask So anyway, energy revenue, we expect to go down. Here you can see 2016, 147, we're projecting 144. The reason for that is essentially that 2016 we had higher revenues than expected, and we expect those higher revenues, they occurred for various reasons which we don't think are going to repeat. John and his team do a lot of work projecting our revenues, and we think these estimates are conservative and accurate. We come down to cost of energy, which we expect to be a little bit higher than last year. The reason for that is basically this 2016 period, the cost of energy is lower than expected due to some renewable projects coming on more slowly, and the renewable projects are higher cost, and so that resulted in lower energy cost of energy for MCE. So you come down to net energy revenue is a little over 16 million. These are our operating, so you can see net energy revenue again at the top. Operating expenses. Any questions about operating expenses?
Sorry, on the energy revenue and energy expenses part.
Yeah.
So you said that you had some unexpected revenue from 2016 that you don't expect to repeat. Why not?
John, do you want to field that one?
Yeah, hi, I'm John DeLessie with Pacific Energy Advisors. So basically, we had our revenue coming in during the summer season was a little bit above projections, and we think it was really just weather driven, so not something that we're relying on. So we just flatlined our original projection going into next year.
So people's usage increased in a way that we didn't predict. Is that what you mean? Like therefore
Yes.
they paid for more?
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, I mean, it was, we're talking about like 2%. I mean, it was pretty minor variance, and so, our sales will fluctuate plus or minus a few percent just due to weather, other changes. So we're trying to be somewhat conservative and not assume we're going to see that again next year. So that's the reason for it.
Any other questions?
Carla? Yeah, go wait a second, David. Yeah, go ahead, Carla.
Carla Small, Town of Ross. I understand what you just said about weather, but that seems a very odd explanation to me. I would think we could be facing a very hot summer where revenue could go up. So it is very interesting to me that we actually lower a revenue number. It just seems odd to me, and it seems, if you could say to me, it's kind of hard because we've increased our number of participants a lot in the last few years, but if you told me the weather impacts for the last 5 years have created such a pattern that you could lower the revenue as opposed to just 1 year, it's just an odd explanation to me. It's kind of like, sounds good, might happen. I mean, who's to say we don't have a warmer summer that could actually increase usage?
Well, that's true. So, I think the fundamental issue here is that our sales, we have a forecast, and actual sales will vary from that forecast. This last year, we had a positive variance, so revenues came in a little bit higher than projected. Next year, they could come in a little bit lower than projected. So rather than, I think we're just trying to be a little bit conservative and not assume that we're going to have a positive variance again next year. I think there's just, the way we look at this, there's a natural variability in the sales, right? And so for budgeting purposes, do we want to, I guess, be more conservative or less conservative? That's sort of the way we look at it. We don't think that the additional kilowatt hour sales are necessarily something that is going to persist. Now, if we get into next year and we see it again, we would certainly want to adjust the forecast at that point. But it's really just a matter of judgment in regards to, do we want to bank on that, or do we want to be a little bit more conservative?
So then how does that affect what you procure in power? I mean, so are you, because I know you buy so much, so far out, so how does that affect that?
Right, so, the net effect of, let's say that sales come in a little bit higher than is projected and budgeted, then the net effect to sort of the bottom line would be positive, because revenues exceed cost of power. So if sales are a little bit higher than projected, we would have more revenue and higher power supply costs, but the difference between those numbers would be positive, and that would accrue to the bottom line. So it is, from a budgeting perspective, it is conservative to be a little bit on the low side in regard to the kilowatt hour sales forecast. Because if sales come out better than that, it's going to be beneficial to the net surplus that's generated.
And John, we would buy the additional power in the spot market, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So, and again, there is always variation in sales. And so we do our best to project on a year ahead, and even, we do an integrated resource plan that's a 10-year sales projection. And when we procure power, we try and buy close to what we expect the need to be for the coming year, but we always recognize that within a few percent there's going to be some variation, and those differences just settle through the market. And so if we need more power, we would just buy more power in the spot market, and if we have excess, so if the sales are lower than projected, then that excess resource would be sold into the spot market. So, but those are very small as a percentage of the overall power supply costs. We're talking maybe 2% in terms of that variance. So the vast majority of those power supply costs and what's being budgeted are known, and it's really just that sales variation, and that's unpredictable. But it's not we don't expect huge swings in that number. But there is a natural variation. Just as a result of weather, a result of customer participation. Some customers may leave, others may join. So there is this natural variation that, you can only get so accurate on the forecast, so.
Just out of curiosity, because I don't have that much knowledge, when you buy in that market, does that historically cost more or less than the average of the other costs of power?
Typically less. It's
Typically less, okay, great.
So
Thank
John,
you.
let me ask you just one other question, because I know there's a certain amount of alchemy that goes into making these kinds of projections. And so and I think it's prudent to take a conservative approach personally. When you're figuring out what a conservative approach means, what time frame are you thinking about? The last few years? I assume it's not just this last year and the year ahead. You're sort of factoring in more patterns and more of expectations over a longer period as well?
We are. So, our customer base is changing, though, so it does complicate the forecasting exercise. So we have historical data for the Marin consumers going back now for, since 2010. The customers in Napa County and Contra Costa County, they do use energy differently than sort of the historical customer base that MCE has had. So we pay a lot of, in the forecast, we do put a lot of emphasis on the most recent 12 months. That's sort of gets the most weight. But then we also look at the prior years. And again, you will see that variation that, if we look at 2015 versus 2014, there's, in 2015, for the same customer base, these sales were increased in the summer. Is that because people are using more energy? Is that because of weather? Is that because of other factors? We really don't know it, but it's just, in our view, it's within just kind of a natural variation that you can expect. So really the question for budgeting is, do you count on that, or do you wait to see if it's a trend?
And it is kind of an organic process as some of our customers are our customers for longer. you have more of a sense of what that pattern is.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
And
okay.
we'll get a better sense this coming year with the new customers. And of course, if there's more expansion, then we have,
Yeah.
you know.
It's organic.
Exactly.
All right,
Yeah, but I
great.
think what's
Thank
really
you.
important, kind of the takeaway here, is that if we end up buying more power than we need, the outcome of that is not as beneficial as if we were to buy just at the amount or maybe slightly under the amount that we anticipate needing. That results in better outcomes. And so I think that what we mean when we're talking about a conservative approach is we don't want to have expectations that are too high and buy too much energy and then have to sell it off at a
Point.
loss.
Great, good point. Thank you, Don. Other questions right now for David? All right, thank you, David.
Moving along. Operating expenses, is there any questions here?
Sashi McEntee, Mill Valley. I remember to do that this time. I know that we have some greater legal expenses because we're doing more, in part because we're doing more regulatory advocacy. And I know, Don, you and I talked about some of that is benefiting CCAs really all over the place, that we're really sort of fronting for. I don't know whether this board has already heard a lot of that, but could you comment on, in the future, if there's some type of organization that is going to be doing more of that advocacy, would that then sort of offload some of those costs for the regulatory piece of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first thing to say is that, you know, we have been carrying the water for a lot of the new CCA efforts, and the advocacy that we've been doing have sort of by default helped other CCAs. That in itself does have some automatic benefits to us, because the more CCAs that exist, the louder voice that we have in general. So we're benefiting ourselves in that way. But in addition to that, there have been discussions recently between MCE and the other CCAs about forming some type of alliance or organization, a coalition that is able to do some cost sharing. We've done a bit of ad hoc cost sharing already. In some cases, we're sharing the attorney's fees when we have the same lawyer helping us with the same regulatory proceeding, and that's worked very well. But we are talking about potentially formalizing that a bit more and using that structure to apply to other things that we're doing jointly. And it might result in some efficiencies and reducing a bit of duplication that might be happening. And we'll have more information on that in the coming months. We're just starting to discuss that at the director level among the other CCAs right now.
Thank you.
I would like to speak to some of the cost drivers, though. I think that, it is a substantial increase in the legal budget, and I would say two of the main cost drivers. One is a change from the other services line item to the legal line item, which relates to our lobbying services that we use. So that's one significant swing. And then another significant swing, one additional driver that's a little bit smaller than that is with our expansion, we expect to have significantly more power purchase agreements and that negotiated. And then the third one is this year we experienced a significant influx of very extensive Public Records Act requests that related to MCE Solar 1 and other threats of litigation. And so we have not had to face those types of litigation costs in the past. And so this allows for headroom to spend legal budgets appropriately in case of litigation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? And Barbara?
Just a quick one. It's good to hear that the CCAs are talking, and potentially maybe that'll.
Barbara, could you associate yourself
Barbara
more
Kohler,
closely with
Fairfax,
there
thank
go.
you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I apologize.
That's okay.
I'll remember. And also I've heard that San Diego will soon launch their CCA, which will take all of San Diego Electric's territory. So I think they'll be very powerful, and that may be a good point to look at, getting together with a very strong advocate.
Super.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, David, you're back. We're back with you.
Okay, great. So, oops, sorry. Top of the line here, so we're expecting operating income of 6.3 million. We have a few, we've listed interest expense. In fact, none of this is interest expense. It's all financing costs related to our letters of credit. We don't expect to spend that much, but we put in the full budgeted amount. We come down to the change in net positions expected for the year, and as I described at the outset, we expect to begin with the period with 25 million. We add 6, and we come to 31 net position at the end of the period. We have some minor additional items, capital outlay, and then the transfer to a local renewable energy development fund, which I'll come to in a minute. Any questions about that before I move on to the other budgets?
Ray?
Ray with the Sausalito. Is the net position primarily liquid?
Well, that's a great question. Yes and no. So let me.
This came up in XCOM. It's a good question.
Well, I would love to actually answer that question in greater depth, but I condensed the balance sheet, so that makes it a little bit harder to do. But let's do this. So your net position is at the end of last year is 13 million. Your question is that net position liquid? And liquidity is a function of how quickly stuff is either cash or turns into cash. That's what liquidity is. So your cash is liquid. And if you were to look at the amount of cash on the balance sheet at this time, I'm going to say it's probably about 10 million. So not all of that 13 million is represented by cash, but you have things like accounts receivable which convert into cash quite quickly. So I think that the right number to think about, rather than, I think liquidity is a good question. Another way of looking at liquidity is to look at your working capital, which is the difference between your current assets and current liabilities. So our current assets are 26 million as of last year, 13 million in current liabilities. So your working capital is the difference between those two, which is 13 million. And that's 13 million is just coincidentally because equal to our net position. So the liquidity of MCE from a balance sheet perspective is good.
Right. So one follow-on. So essentially, this 2016-17 budget, 6 million is dropping into a further cash reserve, in my words.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that roughly right?
Well, it won't necessarily all end up as cash. It will, because what the net position is simply the difference between assets and liabilities.
Yeah. But within a margin of error is about right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Welcome. Any other questions? All right. Back with you, David.
Okay. This is the Energy Efficiency Program Fund. We have 3 more budgets to cover quickly, and then we're done, or not quickly, depending on your preference. The Energy Efficiency Program Fund is 1.2 million, which also is equal to that's the income. This number here is the money that we get from the CPUC, and then this number down here, our expenditures, is the money that we spend. They equal each other. Any questions? Moving on. Local Renewable Energy Development Fund. This fund is funded, the revenues are transferred from the operating fund. There's a formula that we use to compute that number, and the capital outlay associated with that is resulting from the Solar One project in Richmond. It's a capital outlay because we have a leasehold, and these are therefore leasehold improvements that we will be making to that facility. Renewable Energy Reserve Fund, we're not making any changes to the reserve fund right now. We don't have plans at the moment to make expenditures from that fund. That may change as the year goes on. And when we have more concrete plans, we would come back to the board with a proposal. Any questions about the 4 budgets?
Yes.
So just another question. First of all, I just want to compliment you on all the bullet points that you put associated with the numbers. I think that's really, really helpful for many people.
Right.
And, oh, by the way, Emmett O'Donnell, Town of Deberon. Sorry. Hard to get used to that. So my general question is, how will you come back to us with some sort of a budget amendment if these new communities come on within the next fiscal year? How will you be able to deal and account with that?
Yeah, that's correct. There isn't certainty yet, and enough certainty to make projections about.
Tom had to turn his movie off.
The impact of the community. So yes, when they come on, we would come back with a budget provision. All right. I also want to point out that when we come to the board during the year with contracts and new positions. All of that will be included in this budget that you're approving now, unless, if they're not included within the budget, then we would be coming back to you with a budget amendment.
Other questions or comments? Yeah, I want to, we did discuss this in the executive committee, and I want to really compliment your efforts here, David. I think this is great. It's a great way to organize and elaborate on our budget that makes it certainly easier for me to understand some of the categories. So I think this is very helpful. And I know some of our board members have contributed to that conversation as well. So any other comments or questions? Any public comment on the budget?
And I do have
Yeah, Dawn,
one
did you want to?
clarification. I just
Okay.
wanted to clarify that the recommendation is actually is being carried over to the following month. Typically, what we do is we introduce the budget in February, and then it's approved in March.
Okay.
So this action isn't needed this evening. It will be.
Okay, so we're just going to let it seep in for a little while. All right. Anything else? No? Okay. All right, very good. Thank you very much. All right, next is item 7 on our agenda, which is our proposed rates for fiscal year 16-17. John, you're up for this, I think.
Okay, well, this is very closely related to the last item. So Jamie talked about how much money you want to collect, and I'm going to talk about
How much we want to spend? No.
how do you do it? Who do you collect it from, right? What's the rate impact to the budget? So we can go to the first. So this is sort of the rate season. This is a very busy time, January and February, in MCE's rate setting process. So maybe I need to.
Oh, there you go.
So the calendar here, and this is all sort of geared around the start of the fiscal year in April. In January, we really start preparing the preliminary budget for the coming fiscal year and preliminary rates that would be associated with that budget. And we also have an opportunity to really take a look at PG&E's rates. And if you recall, last month's board meeting, I briefed you on the PG&E rate changes and how MCE's rates stack up to PG&E, including the changes to the PCIA. That all informs our proposed rates that we bring before you in the month of February, tonight. These are draft rates along with the draft budget, and then it kicks off a public review period, and then rates are adopted at the March meeting to go into effect in April. A little bit of background in terms of the policies, rate setting policies that have been adopted by MCE. The rates that we strive to design rates that do a number of things, and one of them clearly is that they recover the budget. So that's the policy of revenue sufficiency. That's sort of a bare minimum. But we have other objectives in designing rates, and those include we want to make sure that our rates are competitive. And so our primary competition today is PG&E. Customers can, as we all know, can switch back to PG&E if they desire. So we want to make sure that MCE's combination of service and price is competitive with what they could get from PG&E. We also take into consideration rate stability, and so we like to the extent we can, minimize changes in customers' rates from year to year. Customer understanding is important. It's a policy that we strive for to the extent that we can. Rates are complicated. To the extent we can simplify them, we do. Their equity among customers is also important. So we have 50-plus rate schedules. We have different types of customers that use energy in different ways, from industrial customers to streetlights to residential. And the differences in the rates that those customers pay really should be based on equitable principles, and namely that's differences primarily in the cost of serving those customers. We also consider rate competitiveness issues in designing those rates, but a combination of what it costs to serve a customer and what would they pay with PG&E, those taken together really help guide our rate proposal. And then lastly, the policy of efficiency. So we like to encourage through time of use rates and other rate options, customers send the right signal to use energy at the right times so to conserve. This I won't spend too much time on. The rate setting process really starts with a forecast. So for the coming fiscal year, and we just had that discussion about our sales forecast, for instance, we need to project overall how much energy we think our customers will use, how many customers we think we'll have, and then break that into a great level of detail in terms of the time of when those customers will use energy and demand versus kilowatt hours and all of the different, if you look at our rate schedules, they're fairly complex. So we need to forecast all of those billing quantities in order to derive a revenue forecast, which was reflected in the budget discussion in the prior item. And then we use that forecast to project how much revenue we would collect at the current rates, and also if we're going to be recommending rate changes, how much revenue would the new rate structure generate. Then the revenue requirement is really the budget with a couple of adjustments. That's how much money the rates need to collect. And then once the revenue requirement is decided or adopted, then there's a process of rate design where that revenue requirement is allocated to different customer groups, and then charges applicable to each of those customer groups are designed to recover those allocated charges. Speaking of the customer groups, we, just like PG&E, we categorize the customers into various end uses. And these end uses are grouped this way because they have similar cost of service characteristics. So these are the various rate groups. You'll see this sort of coding, Res 1, Com 1, Com 6. These are examples of the types of customers that would fall into those categories. So Com 1 and Com 6 are really small commercial customers. Com 10 would be what we consider medium commercial, like a bank, a restaurant, that type of a business or operation. And then we get into Com 19 and Com 20. These are really the larger commercial and industrial customers. The Com 20s in particular are really institutional size industrial customers. Then we have a variety of agricultural rate schedules that are offered, and so we treat those customers as a group for rate setting purposes. Street lighting is its own category, and traffic control is its own category. So we essentially borrow from the way that PG&E groups when we do our rate design. So this is our summary of our projected revenues and number of customers served in each of these categories. So we're not projecting a significant change in the number of customers, so a little over 170,000 customers. Again, this would not consider the effects of expansion. As previously discussed, if the results of those studies indicate that it would be appropriate it would be beneficial to existing MCE customers to expand, and the timing is such that it would be within this fiscal year, then all these numbers would change. But we're not counting on that at this time. So here we show in aggregate the number of accounts, the megawatt hours, so it's the annual energy, a little over 1.8 million megawatt hours that we project to our customers to consume this year. And then the revenue at present rate. So under our current rate structure, we are projecting we would collect a little over $145 million in the coming fiscal year. And you can see how that's broken out. Not sure where to point this to get, there we go. Seems a little down. This is just a graphical representation really of the revenue on the prior table. So apologize for some of the micro font here, but almost half of our revenue, 45%, comes from the residential customer sector. And then you can see, small commercial, medium commercial, and large industrial all contribute around 15% each. And then we have industrial at about 8%. And other is agricultural, street lighting, and traffic control, all combined, and they provide around 2% of the overall program revenue. Now the revenue requirement for coming fiscal year, and this is really a virtual direct translation of the budget that was just discussed. There's just a couple of adjustments that need to be made in terms of translating the budget to revenue requirement that the rates need to collect. And those are associated with revenue deficiencies related to our net energy metering program and also uncollectible accounts. So rates need to be set a little bit higher than our expected cost because some customers won't pay their bills, right? So there's a revenue deficiency there. Similarly with the net energy metering program, there's less revenue from those customers. So we take our budgeted amount, which should tie to what you just saw, and we add the deficiencies there, a little over $1 million, and so our revenue requirement is $145,564. That is not exactly a coincidence, but that is exactly equal to what we project our present rates would recover, meaning no need to change rates, that current rates are sufficient to recover the budgeted expenses as well as to generate a surplus of the $6.5 or so million that was included in the total budget. So very good news from that front. There's no need to change rates. In fact, our recommendation is that MCE maintain its current rates through the coming fiscal year. Maybe pause there. We're going to switch gears just a little bit. Are there any questions up to this point?
Sloan?
Yes.
Hi, Sloan Bailey from Corte Madera. John, how different are the rates generally on a per kilowatt hour basis between, say, a large commercial and your basic residential usage? Is it dramatically different? Are they a little bit different?
Well, I mean, the structure is very different. So residential, the generation rate that we charge is just a single cents per kilowatt hour figure, regardless of usage and regardless of season. So it's just a flat rate. If you look at our commercial, let's say our industrial, that would be the other extreme, the COM20 rate. That is a seasonal rate, so we have higher rates during the summer months of May through October than the other months. And it's a time of use rate, so there's a different rate factor applicable to energy consumed during the peak periods of the day, the mid-peak periods of the day, and the off-peak periods of the day. And it includes a demand charge, which is not charged on the basis of energy consumption, but charged on the basis of the maximum demand recorded during that month. So structurally, they're very different. And depending on how the customer uses energy, if an industrial customer were to use primarily off-peak energy, their rate would be considerably lower than a residential customer. With the typical industrial versus, say, a residential, the difference just sort of off the top of my head might be, let's say, for a residential customer, it might be 9 cents a kilowatt hour. For an industrial customer, it might be 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour. But a lot of that is because of the time of use rate and the fact that those industrial customers use more energy during the off-peak than during the on-peak. Helpful?
It's, no, I appreciate the answer. I'd forgotten how complicated it was, and I appreciate the reminding me.
Emma, did you have a question? Somebody else had a question down here? No, okay. Any other questions over here?
Yeah,
Ray?
I got one.
Yeah, thank you.
Ray with East Sausalito. Sort of a follow-on from the question from the previous presentation. You are included in the revenue requirements, allocation for prudent reserve. So in this budget, I'm trying to now remember the numbers, but approximately 6 million is going to be dropped into the operating fund balance, this proposed budget. Last year, or this current year, what is it, 8, 12? I can't remember what your projection was. 12, okay. So in a 2-year period, you've added $20 million to the reserve. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just what it is. So to what extent is there still any policy of figuring out what the accumulated reserve should be, so that it more, instead of being the end result of the calculation of what's left over, it's a bit more prescriptively, this is what we need?
Right.
It's item 9. The
Actually,
good
Oh,
news
is that an agenda?
the good news is it's item 9 on our agenda, Ray.
That serves me.
That's why it sounded so familiar.
So that is an agenda item. And typically when we do set the rates in the budget, it's not so much a residual that is the reserve. We build that in intentionally, but historically, we've generally targeted about a 3% contribution. So 3% of revenues would be kicked over to reserve. That's kind of been the general guideline, but it hasn't been a firm policy. And last year, or this current year, I mean, we're doing great. I mean, this has been a fantastic year, combination of higher than expected revenues and lower than expected costs. We're seeing a much higher reserve contribution.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Kevin, please.
Kevin Harrell from City of Larkspur. I just wanted to clarify, I know you're going to get into this, but when you mentioned that rates are not proposed to increase, that does not take into account what's happening with the PCIA. And I know you'll get into that, but it's relevant, I think, for folks to understand that.
Right, so that's a great point. And so that increase, which was really imposed by PG&E, has already occurred. Right? That happened on January 1st. So, there's no additional increase going forward. And if MCE doesn't change its rates, then there wouldn't be any changes unless PG&E changes their rates again. They won't be changing the PCIA this year. The next time that'll be updated would be January 1st of 2017. So, I mean, that is clearly a relevant issue, but to some degree it's already happened. I mean, it has already happened. And if there are questions about where we stand, I covered that last meeting, but I can go through that again if you want to see that.
No, it's not necessary. It's just just wanted to introduce the notion again as a footnote to the discussion because it's important to people who pay their bills in our community.
Sasha?
So I appreciate the desire to, Sashi McEntee, Mill Valley. I appreciate the desire to not raise rates precipitously, but we have had some increases to our expenses that were just presented. Why not have a modest increase in rates to offset what are some of our increasing expenses going forward?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So I think the fundamental answer really is, we're a little bit above PG&E as it is. And that wasn't the case up until January 1st. So last year and the year before, we were a little bit below PG&E, bottom line to the customer. And as a result of increases in the surcharges that PG&E applies to our customers, this PCIA, we're now on average about 4% higher cost to our customers. So I think that plays into our thinking. And when we discussed this situation with the ad hoc rates committee, the subset of this board, as well as the executive committee, Those considerations were discussed. There was some thinking about, well, maybe we should do sort of an inflationary rate adjustment. And so, those things were discussed, but I think overall, we felt the consensus was when we want to maintain competitiveness, and it's a nice story to say that we're not increasing our rates this year. So that's sort of the backstory.
Have we kept our rates flat, or is this an unusual thing to keep it flat?
This is the first time that rates wouldn't be changed. So since 2010, every year, we've actually increased rates. So this would be unique in that regard.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Tom, please.
How, this is a stupid question, but how do customers how do they fall into a rate schedule? Is that by choice, or are they assigned by somebody? Go back to your rate schedule table, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Okay, and we just, we have many more rate schedules than this. So these are actually aggregations of rate schedules. We have 50 plus. But fundamentally, they are assigned, and we...
By whom?
It's really PG&E. So we, our applicability or eligibility for our rates are tied to PG&E's
Okay.
rates, right? So if it's the E1 customer for PG&E, it's a Res 1 customer for MCE. And there are good reasons why that's the case. But it's really, there's typically a default schedule that you would be assigned to as a customer, and then a variety of optional schedules that you could.
So how about these time of use rates? How do they come in? Are they assigned also?
Well, it depends. So for residential customers, that's an option. So the default rate is E1, that's a flat rate, not time of use. But
Right, but I see this is something I didn't see at our executive, residential TOUA and TOUB.
Okay, so that's what I'm getting to next. So that was the pause, and if we're ready to move into that.
Okay, all right.
Any other questions? Yeah, please,
Sorry.
Emmett, and then we'll come back to you.
Emmett O'Donnell from Tiburon. I just want to make one comment, because I was on the rate setting committee. There's another side story to the fact that we're not raising rates.
Dr. O'Donnell, if you would turn on your microphone.
But you identified yourself.
Identified myself, but now I can't get them all to work. There we go. So there's a little bit of a side story a positive story is that we're also increasing our portfolio of renewable energy and keeping rates at a flat rate. And I think that's a very important story that we need to also get out to our customer base. I just want to bring that point out.
Good point. Yeah. Yep. Okay.
Okay, so now
On to
we'll move
time of
on
use.
to the residential time of use rates. So there's been a movement afoot to reform the residential time of use rate options that have been available traditionally. And so PG&E is, as of coming March 1st, will be eliminating 3 rate schedules. So E7, E8, and E9. E7 and E9 are time of use, E8 is a seasonal rate. But those schedules will be eliminated, and those customers will be transferred to one of 2 new time of use rate schedules. So the new residential time of use rates are ETOUA and ETOUB. The default will be the ETOUA option. So how are these different than the previous time of use rates? Well, first of all, the summer season, so the higher rate season is shortened to 4 months from 6. So the new summer for these rates would be June through September instead of May through October. And then the peak period, so the highest price period, is shifted to later in the day. Under option A, it's from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. And option B is 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. So it's shifted to later in the day, and it's also an hour shorter. Okay, so why, right? So the reason primarily is that the grid is actually changing. So all of the solar that is, people are putting on the roofs, that wholesale size contracts that MCE does a lot of, we're producing a lot of power now during those sort of peak sunlight hours. And so the true peak on the system now has shifted. So it's really no longer that kind of noon to 6 traditional peak. It's now shifted to the time when some of that solar starts to come off, and some of the load, especially the residential load, is still starting to come on as people come home from work, start cooking, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an attempt to make sure that the retail rates are aligned with wholesale system conditions so that customers use energy efficiently. So that's really a primary motivation, is to revamp these time of use periods to more closely align with the conditions on the grid overall. Because we are really kind of tied to the hip with PG&E in regards to our rates structure. PG&E, more than half of the bill relate to PG&E's charges for delivery services and other surcharges. So it's important for a time of use rate that we are consistent. In fact, MCE relies on PG&E to give us the usage data for us to calculate our bills for our customers. So when these customers are transferred to a different rate with a different time of use period, PG&E is going to give us usage, and according to those new time periods, we need to have a rate that's consistent with that. So that's the proposal here, is to make, to adopt comparable rate schedules. So in our case, we call them Res TOU-A and Res TOU-B. Same time of use periods, very, very comparable to the PG&E versions. And the rates that have been designed are shown here in this table. So it's summer on peak, summer off peak, winter on peak, winter off peak structure. And we designed these particular rates so that the customer would essentially pay the same. So when you account for the PCIA and other surcharges, that there would be essential parity between what MCE offers and what PG&E offers. So that's the particulars of that rate design. In terms of how customers will be impacted, there are, MCE has about 2,430 customers that are served on the Res 7 rate that would be transferred to the new Res TOU rate. About 748 of those customers are net energy meter customers, so they're solar customers. So it's not the majority. But what we expect is that most of those customers, the non-solar customers, would see lower costs than they would with the old rate, with the P7, because of the lower on-peak periods, the shortened summer season. The net energy meter customers, though, will see lower compensation for their solar generation for the same reasons, really, lower on-peak rate and shorter on-peak period. So the majority of MCE's net energy meter customers, the majority of our solar customers, are served under other rate schedules, namely either E1 or E6 or a commercial schedule. They won't be impacted at all, but the 748 net energy meter customers currently on Res 7 will see lower compensation for their solar. In terms of impact to MCE, we expect really a de minimis impact on revenue. Less than 1%. It's difficult to know exactly what it's going to be because we don't have the data, but just based on the small number of customers involved, we're confident that it would be a very minor impact on overall revenues. So, any questions on that issue?
Sashi McEntee, Mill Valley. I understand wanting to map our time of use to PG&Es, but since we have a greater renewable mix, does our demand graph look different during, are our peaks different than what PG&Es are, and would it benefit us to have a different, different points there?
That's an interesting question. For the most part, we're operating in the same market. So,
Yeah.
if you look at what does it cost to serve a customer, I don't think there's really a meaningful difference between how MCE would look at it versus how PG&E would look at it. The prices are tending to be higher later in the day. So I don't think so, but I think it's just really a practical consideration. We just fundamentally couldn't bill customers on a different time of use period because we are relying on PG&E. Now that's not true for some of the commercial customers. We get more detailed billing data with hourly, 15-minute billing data. We can compute our own time of use, but for these residential customers, we don't get that level of detail from PG&E, so we really don't have a choice.
Okay, so there's not really any cost optimization opportunity there that we could take advantage of for residential, but for commercial, there is that.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And then, I think where the optimization can come in is some of the thinking that's going on around demand response programs where you can encourage through either technology controls or financial incentives customers to reduce their usage at certain critical peak times or even increase for storage purposes when power is very cheap. So there is quite a bit of thinking going on within the organization about those types of programs, and I think those can be more, you can fine-tune those more so than you can with your just standard rate structure.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board? Yes, Carla.
Carla Small, Ross. Can any MCE customer opt into time of use? And if so, is there a period of time that you opt in?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. So if you're, let's say, a residential, the standard rate is non-time of use, then you can opt in the time of use. So there is, as far as I know, there's no sort of waiting period. It would just be a matter, you'd really have to work it through PG&E because you'd have to switch to a time of use rate with them, and then we would automatically serve you on an equivalent time of use period, the time of use rate that MCE offers.
So if you're an MCE customer, but you call PG&E and tell them you want to go into a time of use?
Right, well, you're a PG&E customer and you're an MCE customer.
Right,
So,
but you're going to time of use because you contact them?
You would contact them, yeah. Say you want to change your rate schedule to, let's say, a ETOUA, as an example. And they would say, okay, and they would process that. And because they would bill you for their delivery charges on that schedule, and then that would automatically trigger a change in MC schedule to the Res TOUA, the equivalent.
Okay.
Tom?
Thank you.
Tom Butt, Richmond. So Carla asked my question, you answered it, but the other part of it is that my solar installer contacted me recently and said that, these rates are changing and PG&E is going to put you in a certain default unless you contact them and tell them to do something else, and we recommend you do that because it's a better deal than where they'll put you automatically. So I wonder if that's some information that we should be, maybe letting our customers know in case they don't get it from somewhere else, assuming it's good advice.
Assuming it's true.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think customer would be, a net energy meter customer would be best served if they're on E7 now to move to E6. E7's been closed for years, so E6 has been the sort of the default time of use schedule that most new customers have signed up with. But that E6 will be closed to new customers in March. So the window is very short. I don't know. I know Justin Kudo has brought this up. I'm not sure if communications have been made or has decided against that. But what you're saying kind of matches my understanding that the customers would be better off on E6 than E2.
Yeah, and Justin has been telling customers that same information.
Yeah.
Denise Athos, Novato. Is there a tool, if somebody wanted to change to the Res TOUA or B, in order to know if there's really going to be a difference to it before they go to the trouble of contacting PG&E and going through all that. Is there something that can easily tell them what the benefit would be to them to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know that PG&E has that capability where I've done it personally, so I assume it's available to everybody. You log in through their My Energy tool or whatever it is, and they'll say, look at your rate options, and based on kind of the smart meter history that you have, they'll show you would you be better off on a time of use or your current rate or something else. I know that these new rates aren't in there yet because I just checked recently, but that's the PG&E side. With MCE, I know there are rate calculator tools. I'm not as familiar with, I don't know that they actually look at different time of use options for you. I mean, maybe something.
Right.
I'm not sure. I don't think we have that, but I'll have to look to others to answer that. I think PG&E does, and the only rub with that is they're using their rates for that
Right.
comparison, and not ours. So it's not exactly right. It wouldn't be exactly right, but it would probably be in the right direction. If they say you're better off on a time of use rate with their rates, you're probably the same. The rates are very similar.
Okay, thank you.
And once we approve rates, then those will be plugged into our calculator. And so
Okay.
customers will be able to compare that way. A good way to think about which category works for you is to think about when you're home. If you have a regular schedule for when you tend to be home, when you're using energy the most, that can have a lot to do with which schedule works for you. It's really just a 1 hour difference. But we will, if these rates are approved, then we'll include them in our calculator.
Good, thank you.
Rich?
This might have been answered, but just in case not, the time of use A and B schedules, there, if I remember right, you showed that they are only 1 hour difference from each other?
Right. So there is a more significant difference, but it's all on the PG&E side of the bill, and that is that the A option includes a baseline credit, and the B option does not. So, but the baseline credit is all on the delivery side, so to us it sort of irrelevant, right?
So that hour difference doesn't really mean much?
I mean, it's pretty subtle, the difference there. It's really the primary for a customer looking at this and considering their PG&E charges and MCE customers, really I think the primary decision is going to be, do I want the baseline credit that would be provided for usage up to the baseline allowance in the month, so it's a negative charge, it would be a credit, or not. I think the time periods, maybe that is relevant, but it's pretty subtle.
So are you saying then that this schedule is basically created to help the delivery services for PG&E and what they have available at the peak times for the rate payer?
I think I wouldn't say necessarily it's focused on delivery services. I think it really, this change in the time period is more associated with generation services and
The usage.
In the time of use rate, what you're trying to do really is tell customers when's the most efficient time to use energy, and you do that through pricing differences, right? So this shift is really to indicate that under current grid conditions, we prefer you not use as much power during these windows, the 3 to 8. The old window used to be noon to 6. That's changed because of the changes on the resource mix on the grid.
So time to start having dinner later.
Yeah, it's a little bit late. Like Spain.
Like 10, right, exactly. Any other questions for John at this time? Any public comment on this item?
Can you make a motion?
Would you? That'd be wonderful.
Yeah,
Oh, John, were you done? I'm sorry, I was roaring
So
ahead.
the recommendation is, this is, I guess, draft, right? So this,
It's a new action
continue
item.
current rates for the fiscal year, and then
It's an
bring this
action
back
item.
next board meeting
It's
to
not.
adopt this.
This is not an action item tonight, Don?
However, we do
Yeah.
need to take action on the second bullet
There we
being
go.
The
recommended.
TOU
here.
rates.
So, because the PG&E equivalent rates go into effect March 1,
Mhm.
we want to go ahead and approve these so that ours can go into effect March 1 as well.
Right, thank you. So adopt, the recommendation there is to adopt Res TOUA and Res TOUB to be effective March 1st, 2016.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? Any abstentions? All right, that's approved. Thank you very much, John. And we're moving on. The next item on our agenda is the electric schedule for our 100% local solar electricity, Local Sol. Kirby, I was wondering when you were going to get with us.
It was almost like I was never going to come back. Anyway, I'm Kirby Bell with Pacific Energy Advisors. Good to be here. We'll be talking about electric schedule local Sol, which, as you have already pointed out, is a new service option available to our customers that is primarily focused on the availability of 100% locally generated photovoltaic solar electricity. It's a mouthful. But this is really kind of about removing barriers, and we've spent a great deal of time actually. This is kind of been about really dating back to the first annual board retreat, where we first kind of brought this concept up, discussed it a little bit, talked about a program that existed within the Sacramento Municipal Utility District service territory called Solar Shares, and the success of that program and how it was really designed to remove barriers for certain customers that really weren't well equipped to put photovoltaic solar on their homes or businesses. So back in April of 2014, we talked about this subject with the board, and your board generally approved the principles for such a program. Since that time, there's been a lot of work done really focused on under the feed-in tariff program to identify a project that was appropriate to support this program. And one project has been identified. It's located at the Cooley Quarry in Nevada. It's about a 1 megawatt project. It's perfect for this particular opportunity and will be the host project, if you will, for Local Sol. Now that we have that project, to implement the program, we need to adopt terms and conditions in the form of a tariff. So you'll see in your packet tonight a draft of electric scheduled Local Sol that outlines the terms and conditions of this particular program. So without further ado, we'll spend just a little bit of time here if I can. There we go. Small font, and I apologize. Hopefully you can see it better on the iPads that are in front of you. Bit of background here. As I've already mentioned, program name Local Sol. Really the purpose of this program is to provide MCE customers with an opportunity to purchase on a 100% voluntary basis locally generated photovoltaic solar electricity from a new facility located, of course, within MCE service territory. So the idea here, of course, is all homes, all businesses aren't really well situated for the installation of on-site photovoltaic solar. And this really is about removing those barriers to the extent that customers have overly shaded rooftops, roof orientations that really aren't optimal in terms of solar installations. They don't own the structures that they're residing in or doing business in and the like. This is really an opportunity for them to support a locally situated solar project without having to situate it and install it on their home or business. The product that's being purchased by the customer is a bundled product. We've heard a lot about unbundled renewable energy certificates. This is kind of this is the other side of the equation. This is bundled renewable electricity. So the customer is buying both the electricity and the environmental attribute delivered contemporaneously. Participation is limited. As you can imagine, we've got over 172,000 customers, and we've got a 1 megawatt project. That means not everybody can participate, and I think when we get into this discussion a little bit more, you'll see that that's probably not going to be desirable for everybody, because this does come at a very significant cost premium that is directly tied to MCE's feed-in tariff, which is really embedded with various incentives that reflect the local development costs that are higher than they are elsewhere, as well as other financial incentives to attract developers to this particular market. And then for customers that do choose to participate, I think it's noteworthy that, of course, PG&E's delivery services and charges will continue to apply. So you don't really kind of avoid that. Okay, so I mentioned before we've done a lot of looking into this particular program. We've talked with SMUD, we've done various research, we've read the tariffs that are applicable and gone through all of the online rate calculators, and it was really interesting to see in the case of SMUD in particular, just how quickly this program is fully subscribed. It was very well received by customers. They enjoyed the opportunity to participate and support a local solar project when they couldn't otherwise do so at their home or business. We talked about this with the technical committee and weighed the costs and benefits. Also brought this to your board, as I mentioned, back in April 2014, where the program elements, in general terms, were approved. And then we've also, as a result of discussing this program, gone through the process of adapting MCE's feed-in tariff to actually accommodate a bit more capacity to deal with this sort of program. So here's a comparison. Okay, great. Here's a comparison of MCE's Global Soul program, as contemplated, MCE's Deep Green program, and then PG&E's Solar Choice program, which is kind of their green tariff that you've heard about. This is something that they've recently made available. There are two flavors, if you will, of PG&E's green tariff, one of them being branded as PG&E Solar Choice, the other is Regional Solar Choice. There is a bit of misinformation here, and so I want to point out that when we're looking at the different options that are available, PG&E Solar Choice is the more kind of general, if you will, of their two solar options. For customers participating in the PG&E Solar Choice option, the project will be located anywhere in PG&E service territory, not within the county of the participating customer. That element is related to the Regional Solar Choice option, which is separate and distinct and likely more costly as well. So you can see here how things generally compare in terms of location. With Local Soul, we're talking about a project within MCE service territory. Of course, for Deep Green, there's a more regional approach, although that is changing a bit over time. We're infusing more California-based resources, but again, there is a pretty noteworthy difference between these two programs. And then, of course, with PG&E Solar Choice, which is generally comparable in terms of its structure and offering to Local Soul. It's important to note that despite again what the slide says here, for PG&E Solar Choice, the project can be located anywhere within Northern California, anywhere within PG&E service territory, which is generally Northern California. So here we're talking about exclusively local. Here we're talking about almost anywhere within Northern California. The product and the certification here is generally equivalent, and while we haven't determined definitively whether or not we're going to pursue green energy certification for the Local Soul program, it is a program that's very well suited for that certification, and it can be very easily achieved. And that might be something we want to think about doing in the not too distant future. But it wasn't an element that was approved when we brought it to the board, so that's something we could take up this evening, to be perfectly honest, I think. This is also something I think that's noteworthy in terms of differentiating the various product options that are available to MCE customers and, of course, PG&E customers as well. With Local Soul, we're talking about a new project built this year. It's expected to come online in April or May of 2016, so in just a few short months. With PG&E Solar Choice, for the time being, they are relying on existing projects to support program participation. And then the idea is that will change over time as new projects are developed. Those will become kind of the host projects for the Solar Choice program. But I think, again, there's kind of an immediate designation of a new resource under the Local Soul program, which is, I think a benefit in that regard. And then, of course, for Local Soul and Solar Choice, we're talking about the exclusive production of solar electricity, whereas with Deep Green, we're talking about a combination of resources. For 2015, we expect that Deep Green will include both wind and solar, and then over time, really an even broader use of resources still. Now here's kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of the customer bill impacts, which are not insignificant. This is a kind of truly premium product, if you will, with with a price that reflects that. This price here is fully loaded, for lack of a better expression, reflecting the cost of MCE's feed-in tariff, which is being paid to the project developer for all energy produced at the site, plus a modest administrative adder, plus the PCIA, power charge adjustment. So this is an all-inclusive cost for the customer. Deep green, you can see by comparison, much cheaper. This is the residential rate, MCE's residential rate, plus the PCIA. So again, kind of fully loaded, if you will. And then when we move over to PG&E, you can see here their basic residential rate, but they also have a variety of kind of extras that are embedded. One is a kind of the general program cost, and then the other is the PCIA, because customers that participate in these voluntary options are also charged the PCIA. So, you know, when you kind of look at these premiums down here across the board, you know, you can see how they all relate to one another and how the cost ultimately shakes out for the customer.
Previous slide, you showed that we're selling the customer a bundled product. Are we retiring the RECs for this program, not in our general portfolio?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for asking that. So the idea is, much like we treat our Greenie Energy certified green product, we'll be treating this similarly. So kind of per statute, we're obligated to deliver a certain quantity of RPS eligible energy to these customers because the Cooley Quarry project will be an RPS eligible facility. 25%, for example, which is the prevailing procurement mandate in 2016, 25% of that power will be reflected in our RPS report. 75% will not, because it's basically a voluntary purchase. And to include that in our RPS report would be kind of a violation, if you will, of the Green Energy National Standard. And I think it's probably contemplated that we're going to go that route, and that accounting seems like it's also consistent with FBC guidelines and some other discussions that we've had along the way. So yeah, this really is truly kind of a carve out for the benefit of these customers. It's not to benefit MCE at large or the RPS reporting metrics that MCE will represent annually. All right. So let's see here. Just kind of quickly, because I think we've touched on some of this stuff already, and you can certainly slow down if you have questions on any of these items. Just a reminder that participation is limited. A 1 megawatt project here within Marin County is expected to produce about 1.8 million kilowatt hours a year. We're going to carve out 90% of that so that we don't oversell. We just want to avoid that risk. Which equates to about 100 to 200 kind of accounts, depending on the mix of residential and commercial customers. And you'll see within the draft electric schedule local sold that there is a limitation that's contemplated in terms of the average energy use of participating customers. To the extent that we have a really large customer that wants to participate, we kind of reserve the right, if you will, to kind of back those customers out in the event that their usage exceeds 3,000 kilowatt hours a month or more as averaged over a 3-month period, and we'll monitor that over the course of the customer's participation. In terms of the pricing, again, it's based on it's really a pass-through of our feed-in tariff price. So again, looking back at the electric schedule local sold, you'll see a price not to exceed 14.2 cents, and that will remain in effect so long as the customer continually participates in the program up to a 20-year term. So talk about rate stability. This is kind of the apex of rate stability. It is a very high rate at the beginning, admittedly, but that will remain fixed up to a 20-year period, so long as the customer continues participation over that period of time. It could go down, however, to the extent that we get a lot of interest in the local solar program and decide to expand the program beyond that 1 megawatt. If the next resource that's included as a host site comes in at a cost below the current number, then we could conceivably reduce that rate. for the local solar program, based on kind of an average of the costs to support the customers. And then, as with any feed-in tariff program, there's always economic development opportunities. To the extent that we have very robust participation in the local solar program, and by the way, we talked about 100 to 200 customers. We've already received early enrollments for 100 accounts, so we're kind of well on our way, and the project hasn't even been commercially operational yet, so I think that's good news. But to the extent that we do get participation in the program in general interest exceeding the 1 megawatt that we've got allocated to the program currently, we could conceivably really kind of expand our feed-in tariff program to accommodate additional projects. And then
those 100 customers represent what percentage of the megawatt hours that the facility can
less
produce?
than half. It's currently less than half. So it's about, we've kind of agreed at the staff level that once we get to a 50% threshold in terms of the amount of energy associated with the early enrollees, that we kind of recalculate and start closely monitoring as we move into that kind of home stretch and rounding out the program. But right now we're below 50%. So yeah, mostly residential customers, as I understand it. So we can still accommodate quite a few more. And then in terms of the annual reconciliation, we want to make sure that we keep the accounting completely clear and transparent regarding production of the facility and usage of participating customers. We're going to track both on a monthly basis, make sure that we're kind of where we need to be over time and not overselling the program, as I previously mentioned. And the idea is that we'll come back to your board once a year with kind of a report and also send related communications to the participating customers as well. And then with regards to billing, this is kind of an interesting idea because it is a flat price. It may actually simplify billing for certain customers that are used to paying different rates at different times of day or different seasons. This will just be one rate, and it will replace the customer's otherwise applicable rate prior to conversion over to the local solar program. And I think it is worth noting, John mentioned in the rates presentation, some customers, particularly commercial customers, are subject to demand charges on a monthly basis based on the specific instance at which they used energy most intensively during that month, and those charges would continue to apply. So this is really just replacing the generation charges alone, not demand charges. And then I already mentioned that green energy certification may be pursued for this particular program. And then just one more time with the rate comparison, please kind of strike the regional element here. This is just PG&E Solar Choice. Top line, of course, are generation charges. And then we've also got the fees, PG&E fees. In the case of all the MCE examples here, this is the PCIA only. In the case of PG&E, this is the PCIA plus the program charge. That's what they're calling it. And so you can see the total buildup here in terms of the cost. Again, not insignificant. Local Sol compared to Solar Choice, you're talking about a 24% premium, and then Local Sol compared to Deep Green, you're talking about a 43% premium. Not inconsequential, but again, this is directly related to the costs of the underlying power that MCE is incurring. So, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Emmett?
Yes, please.
Emmett O'Donnell from Tiburon. So I was just wondering how you came up with this kind of pricing structure, because to me, it just seems it's sort of like just a hedge against the future with an RPS benefit that goes along with it. And it kind of flies a little bit contrary to what an actual customer does when they actually put solar on their own roof. They pay a very large upfront fee to have that done, and therefore their cost of energy goes down to very minimal or zero or on the plus side. And I was wondering if you thought about structuring it similarly, where, for example, you charged a big premium for the next 5-7 years to be part of this program and you have blocked off solar generation from this facility, and then you drop the rates down dramatically lower to be well below the level of, current rates or down to close to a zero rate or something like that. And I think that, in my opinion, I think customers would be more interested in that than they would be just knowing that they're always paying for ad forever, infinity, a higher charge unless, suddenly the market went up above theirs. And recently the market hasn't been going up because the renewable energy market has been going down. So I'm just wondering how you thought of that and if you thought of an alternative sort of pricing structure.
Yeah, so we thought about a number of pricing structures, and, I think the SMUD pricing structure for the solar shares program is really the most interesting, but it's also a pricing structure that can only be effectively implemented by a fully integrated utility. And because we don't control both sides of the bill, it's very hard to implement a pricing structure similar to what SMUD did, which is basically you're paying a capacity charge, so you're
Right.
essentially buying, truly, renting, if you will, a share of that facility.
Right.
And then whatever that facility produces, you receive an allocation of the electric output in proportion to your investment in the facility, if you will.
Right.
And then that's credited against the energy that you otherwise use.
Right, correct, like a net metering charge type.
Correct, and that structure doesn't really work for us because we can't, we don't have that relationship with PG&E where we can do something similar. And of course, there's really not any incentive for that.
It's because of that specific reason, because when you're a solar customer and you're net metering, you're still paying the PG&E transmission charge as part of that, but you're paying separately, of course, on a net metering basis on the production and use of the energy. You couldn't fashion this program similar to a net energy metering program?
The problem is that from PG&E's perspective, their meter is never, the customer's meter is never going to roll backwards in the eyes of PG&E.
Oh, I get it.
So that's really the rub. And so
Okay.
it's kind of an unfortunate situation. The Tucson electric program is really kind of more similar to the structure that we have here, where there's an intent to pass through the costs with, I think, with a small subsidy that's by the utility to kickstart the program. Quite
Okay.
frankly. But it's basically a pass through of the costs, and customers can participate in blocks. They can, I think, buy 500 kilowatt blocks each month, and that's kind of the structure there. But with this particular program, I think what was, there was a couple of things that really made the pricing proposal sensible, and one of them is, I think you made a comment about, there's this RPS benefit. Well, there's really not, because the portion, 75%, for example, in 2016, 75% of that 100% solar supply to the customer will be voluntary, and we can't include that in our RPS report. So there's really no inflation of MCE's overall numbers as a result of customer participation. That's really the customers alone that benefit. And then in terms of the fixed element, there's some alignment with the general rate-related principles that John laid out, one of which was rate stability. And while, maybe it's a little bit unaccurate to pay the same rate over time, and even though rates have been very low over the past couple of years, historically they've increased, a few percentage points every year. And so I think the idea here is that the price is not only reflective of the premium product, now, but over time, as other costs increase, there may well be a point at which you cross over. I don't know if that.
No, I understand. I mean, it's just a theory that you could go one theory or you could go the other theory of charging more upfront, higher rates for a 5-year period, dropping the rates dramatically lower, or just charging a marginally higher rate for a fixed period for a longer period of time.
In a really simple answer, I think is more directly related to the communications element, which is simply telling the customer 14.2 cents
And how would you deal with oversubscription if you had?
Well, so this idea, and directing Castle, his question about where we were now relative to total estimated production of the facility, that's where monitoring the historical usage of the early enrollees becomes really critical, because we want to make sure that we remain at or below that 90% of expected production at all times, so we never run into that situation at all, and have a little bit of buffer. For example, if weather-related events cause usage to be a little bit higher, to the tune of 2-3%, we'll still have adequate coverage.
But I mean, if you sold this quarry project out quickly, would you then look quickly to develop a second or third? Maybe it wasn't even based on the feed-in tariff, or just as a way of creating a local sold program, or?
I think we have flexibility there, and I think that kind of the first item or the course of action that we'd likely take is establish a waiting list. And then once we realize that there's significant interest on that waiting list, I don't think we're bound by the feed-in tariff. I think we could take another course of action, and if that resulted in lower overall program costs, we would certainly come back and have a discussion about driving down rates at that point in time.
Any other questions for Kirby? Ray?
Ray with the Sausalito. I think you said you had about 100 pre-enrollees. They're presumably MCE customers already, right? Yeah. So how many light green and how many deep green have pre-enrolled?
It's a great question. I wish I had the answer, but I don't.
My question might be a little revealing to the learning curve I'm on, but I was just curious, you're saying MCE would be purchasing about 90% of what the producer is providing, and I'm just curious, what do they do with the other 10? Does PG&E buy it, or somebody else, or they do something else with it?
Okay, so thank you for that question. I think it's an important clarification. MCE will be buying 100% of the output, regardless of subscribership. As a participating project in MCE's feed-in tariff program, we're going to buy all the output, so long as we don't have participation that fully subscribes to the project. So to the extent we do have full subscribership, the customers in the program would basically be accounting for 90% of that, power that's being produced, and the MCE would basically buying on behalf of its other customers the remaining 10%. Does that make sense? So 100% of it's going to be bought by MCE, the contract will be between MCE and the project developer, and then to the extent that subscribership is lagging, MCE will be buying all the power up until the point where you've got 100% subscription.
What does MCE do with that 10% until it gets used?
Yeah, so it's going to be part of its overall resource mix. It's going to be reflected in its power content labels. Yeah.
Any other questions for Kirby? Any public comment? Who would like to make a motion?
I just have one
Okay,
one
yeah,
comment.
please, Jim.
I'll keep it short.
Okay.
I just heard the comment that store and save. That 10% that Renewable Energy doesn't buy from the homeowner who has solar panels on his house or the business or stuff, which leads me to believe that we don't store electricity in the grid. So that was a good question, but it's a question that leads me to believe that you don't know as much about this as I would like you to know, and the rest of you are as confused as I suspect.
I'm an alternate.
You're an alternate, okay, but I'm kind of convinced that there's nobody in the public that can tell you what a feed-in tariff is.
That's not true.
There's one, well, okay, I'm wrong. How many?
Lots of people do know what that is.
But thanks for holding our feet to the fire, Jim. Is there anything else you want to say right now?
Oh, I have lots, but I just...
Keep it short and succinctly.
Yeah, I've heard that before, so anyway, I just... Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you. All righty. Is there somebody who'd like to make a motion on
Yeah, I'll make a motion to approve the electric schedule local 100% local solar electricity supply for meeting implementation.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? Any abstentions? All righty. Very good. Thank you, Kirby, for the presentation. That's great. And now, we're on to draft reserve policy, much to Ray's relief. Greetings, David.
David McNeil, Finance and Project Manager for MCE. Sure.
Just for the benefit of the minutes, Director Alternate Kinney and Director Butt were absent for that vote.
Okay. David.
Thank you. So we're presenting this evening the reserve policy for MCE and your consideration. Is there a way to pull up the presentations that I had before easily?
Oh, yes. Yes.
You could do that while I'm.
You mean the budget?
Yeah, it'll be easier to reference some things at that point.
Right.
That's easy.
What do you like off?
If you can kind of back it up to the,
Back it up, okay.
Yeah.
Tell me what you're.
one more. One more. You know, there, that's it, yeah, back one. Okay, so reserve policy for MCE. Throughout our existence, we've been accumulating reserves in our net position, which you can see on the balance sheet. Just to recap, the net position is the difference between our assets and our liabilities. We're blessed with a fairly simple structure in that our net position increases when we record essentially what you can think of as net surpluses at the end of the year. So if we record, if our revenues exceed our expenses, we record a surplus, and that amount is contributed to the net position. If the expenses exceed the revenues, we experience a deficit, and that would reduce the net position. So what you're looking at there is the accumulated surpluses of MCE over its existence. That raises the question of, well, what's our objective as an organization? How big do we want these reserves to grow? And the purpose of the reserve policy is to answer that question. Reserves have a number of important functions for any organization. Reserves are critical to allowing MCE to meet its obligations to suppliers as agreed. It's important to ensure that we meet our bank covenants. It's important to ensure that we have we project financial strength and stability to the market so that we can buy power cost effectively. And it's important to accumulate for any organization, some rainy day reserves in case there's a problem with the organization. So the reserve policy sets out a methodology for computing what our reserve target is. It's based upon a percentage of operating expenditures, and a separate calculation that's based on a percentage of annual revenues. As the organization grows, as our expenditures and our revenues grow, so too will the reserve targets according to this formula. As I mentioned, we're expecting to finish this year with 25 million of reserves, or a net position of 25 million. And the reserve targets, according to those calculations, are in the neighborhood of 50. So we're about halfway there. We hope to achieve that target by 2019, and this year's the budget that you were presented with tonight is going to take us an important step in that direction. Any questions?
David, just one comment, and I didn't notice this when we talked about the executive committee meeting, but I'm wondering if, assuming we adopt this, if the terminology total reserve requirement shouldn't be total reserve target, some people could read requirement as that's something we're supposed to achieve as opposed to a target we want to achieve.
I'm fine with that. If we want to change the word from requirement to target, I have no problem with that.
Sashi McEntee, Mill Valley, but I think once you pass 2019, you want it to be a requirement. You don't want it to be a target, right? Is that not, at this point, we're trying to get there, but once we get there, we do want to say that's the requirement. Is that not right, or?
That's the intent.
Yeah.
That's the intent, yeah.
Sorry to take, I was just pausing because the reserve policy does say that there might be instances in which the board decides to dip into reserves for a purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we did do that, and so the total reserve fell below 20%, then having it be a requirement makes us feel like we're in a position where we just did something that wasn't quite right because we violated our own requirements. So there is a little bit of a,
Sure.
I see your point, but there's a little linguistic implication there that I think is important. Carla, did you ask?
2 points. One, just to piggyback on that, you might be able to set it as a requirement, but then have board-accepted policies of why you dip into it. What are the reasons? What are the approved reasons for dipping into it? Just a quick note, when I was going through the summary for your draft reserve policy, it just mentioned that available cash was 18 million as of December 31st, 2015.
Yeah.
And so I'm just looking up there at your net position of 2015, so I'm just, you had 18 in here, and
Yeah,
my
sure.
interpretation of what I'm looking at
So
there
these
is,
are two different things. These are two different, this
I know.
statement of position is a point in time. So this point in time is March 31st, 2015, and then the $18 million number that I referenced is December the 31st, 2015.
Okay,
it's a
so
different
that-
point in time. The number bounces around every day, quite frankly.
Right.
That's just the nature of the business.
okay.
Barbara?
Barbara Kohler, Fairfax. I think I would suggest that we stay with the term requirement. In Fairfax, we have a 25% reserve policy requirement. And when we do dip into reserves, that's a very serious action that we take that comes to the council, and we make those decisions for those few times where we need to do that. But I think with the idea of requirement, and given our need to have a lot of cash on hand if things change, I would argue for the term requirement, not a target, because it's really something that we want to stay with, but when we really need to go into it, we do that, and I think as a full board, we would do that rather than trying to figure out all the hypothetical scenarios where that might be appropriate.
Bob McCaskill, I don't feel strongly about it. The only reason I recommended it is that when I read the word requirement, that would suggest that this board will be violating that requirement for a number of years because we're nowhere close to reaching that requirement. And a layperson reading our board policy would say, gee, that board's been violating their own requirement for several years because we're nowhere near that requirement right now. So that was the only reason I suggested it.
Well, I'm just going to ask a question of clarification. You're looking at the reserve policy itself, and then you're looking at the last sentence?
Yeah, down at the bottom where it says total reserve requirement in the example at the bottom of the page.
Are we looking at the reserve policy or the staff report?
You look at the staff report.
Page 1 of the staff report.
Okay, so we're gonna ask the board to approve the policy rather than the staff report. The only reference I see to reserve requirement is in the last sentence of the reserve policy itself. It says the future development of MCE may require the expansion of reserve requirements to support new activities such as the major expansion of MCE activities or the acquisition of generating assets. So I think in that context, I'm comfortable with the word.
Yeah, the wording up above doesn't bother me, but, you know, the whole thing kind of goes together, and to be in the example, be using the word requirement when that isn't really what's stated in the policy was what troubled me a little bit.
Okay. That's a fair statement. I just want to also clarify that this policy is, our reserves will only grow or contract consistent with an approved budget. right? So that's the mechanism by which the board would approve, or the organization would approve the growth or contraction of reserves.
Sashi, please.
Sashi McEntee, Mill Valley. So two things. One is, can you explain where 90 days came from as opposed to 6 months? And also, are you comfortable with what I think you said before was a 4% annual contribution towards reserves that's sort of baked into the rate structure? Actually, I think that was part of your presentation.
Yeah. We're comfortable with the 4% target. Your first question.
Why 90 days?
Yeah, 90 days.
Yeah, for cash.
It's a convention in businesses. In fact, that's at the low end of the convention.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking about. Yeah.
So it's a good question.
Yeah.
We looked at a number of different organizations and it seemed reasonable given where we're at right now. We're at 25 million of reserves. The formula requires us, or it sets a target of 50 million. We're a long way from there.
Yeah.
If we get to that number, if and when we get to that number, hopefully sooner than expected, then we'll have maybe something else to think about. Well, is that 90 days? Should that 90 days be 120 days? But it seems like a good start.
I agree with you there, but if there's a desire to have it be a greater number, we could potentially include that intent in the language of the statement that we are targeting this at this point and hope to increase it in the future because of whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether you.
Yeah.
I understand that at this point in time, it's good. We're not even there yet. So, but. If you were able to set it wherever you wanted it to, do you think that 90 days would be adequate?
I think that it would. It would be adequate. I'm comfortable with that number. If the nature of the business changes, if the risk we experience out in the market makes us concerned and makes us think that the reserve should be larger, then we would come back and revisit the policy and perhaps bring it back to the board with a larger number at that time. But for now, I'm comfortable.
And that's just on the cash side. On the contingency side, so this is the 15% contingency is for just a budget contingency for unexpected expenses and also a rate stabilization reserve. So that one, I'm wondering when we would want to use that contingency to stabilize rates and how far we're willing to go on that. And because it's called a contingency / rate stabilization, I would think that we'd want to have some constraints on that on what kind of piggybacking on what Carla said about under what circumstances would we dip into the reserve.
Right. Well, just to clarify, those are it's a method of calculating what the net position of MCE should be. So they don't in and of themselves limit how we choose to invest the net position. So they're really just a methodology for arriving at the number rather than being subcategories of the reserves, if you follow me.
So, is there a reason why it's called a rate stabilization? Why it's not just called a contingency? It's because you put that in there. It then raises the question of, okay, well then, so we want to keep rates flat from year to year, so we're going to dip into this on a regular basis in order to keep the rates flat, and that's what we're like. Is that?
It's intended to signal some of the uses of net position or reserves, and that's sort of described more fully in the document.
Yeah.
I'll make a motion that we.
I just want to make one little quick comment. Emmett O'Donnell from Tiburon. I think it's a amazing theoretical discussion that we're having here. If you harken back to 4 or 5 years ago when we could barely come up with a $5 million loan. I just want to say that, saying words, I think Bob McCaskill made a very wise point in putting sort of constraints or requirements on exactly what the reserve should be may not be in our best interests. John has told us many times in the past how circumstances change, where all of a sudden we're not getting as much revenue in as we possibly. We would have to dip into reserves if we were to lose on a particular year. Nothing is guaranteed. And for us to set a hard and fast requirement, especially when we're looking at trying to upgrade some of our banking situations and becoming a little more bigger player in the financial markets, I think we need to have the kind of flexibility and not put serious restraints on exactly like a reserve policy, like we're all familiar with in our own particular towns and jurisdictions. I think that's a kind of an important point that I just wanted to point out there.
Ray.
One last clarifying question. If you don't factor in, the distorting effects of expansion, and just think of a sort of natural growth in our revenue projections, how long is it actually, if you then routinely throw off 3-4% of annual expenditures, how long is it going to take to get to the reserve level that you're anticipating, that you're targeting?
Well, it would take, in rough terms, we need an additional 30 million. We're throwing off about 6 million a year at current revenue levels. Those revenues are expected to change, so you're looking at about 5 years. Does that sound right?
All right.
Unless we have another year like last year when we threw off 12.
Yeah,
Or more.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I wanted to make sure it wasn't 20 years.
Yeah, 5 sounds better than 20, is that it?
Yeah.
All right, Carla.
Just a quick question. So how do we invest the reserves? The unrestricted, I guess?
Yeah.
How is it invested?
Well, it's a good question. It kind of goes back to a question that was asked earlier about, are these reserves cash?
Yes.
Which I didn't give a great answer to. The net position it's a residual number. It isn't anything. It's just the difference between assets and liabilities. So it's sort of like, you have, an apple and an orange on one hand, and then you have a pear on the other. And what's the difference between the apple and the orange and the pear? Is it an apple? Is it orange? There isn't, conceptually the question doesn't really, so the net position, there isn't something to invest. What we have to invest are our assets. So, and we invest our assets in some of it is held in bank accounts, some of it is in savings accounts, some of it is held as receivables, some of it is held as leasehold improvements. That's actually the.
It's not a siloed account.
That's right. It's not an account. It's just a residual.
Yeah, but also to add a
But a
bit more
reserve
to the question, we're actually in the process of developing an investment policy, and that will be coming to XCOM in April. And the thinking behind this is actually a topic that the executive committee has spent a lot of time on over the last year. We wanted to first get a reserve policy in place so that we can kind of have a routine that we're using and something that we can kind of latch onto with the accrual of reserves. But then the next step really is to think about how we will invest those reserves once they accumulate. We aren't at the point yet where we have enough reserves sitting around to invest. As David was saying, there's a lot of this, the cash being built up is being used as working capital and for our monthly expenses. So we don't have an access of cash sitting around, but eventually we will. And so getting an investment policy in place in advance of that point in time is really a good idea. So we'll be talking about that in about 2 months.
And we have to follow the way the towns do the California
Yes,
municipal
our
code for
investment policy will be built on the legal requirements for a local government agency.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sashi.
Sashi McEntee, Mill Valley. It maybe it would be clearer question of what's the difference between cash and an asset. If you could maybe in the next balance sheet have a line for cash and cash equivalents, just so people would understand what's cash and you have your assets, which include cash and other things that have value, and you have your liabilities, which are negatives off that. And if you were to theoretically say, let's just close this all out, how much would we have left like at this moment, it would be the net position. So I think that when people, when we sort of colloquially think of cash, that's a different thing than what is in an accounting balance sheet. So perhaps that would be a way to clarify it, is to have a line for cash and cash equivalents.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you for that suggestion.
Other comments or questions from the board? All right, good conversation. And I actually, looking at the wording of the policy itself, I think it does strike a nice balance in giving some guidelines for what the purpose of the reserves is, what they conceptually could be used for without constricting it. So I actually think this is pretty well done. So barring any other, did you have a comment or question, Tom?
I had a motion.
A motion would be good. You made that motion already.
Well, I was about halfway through it. And
Oh, you want to go back? All right, then you got distracted.
I'll start over
You start
again.
over again, okay.
So I move approval of policy 013 reserve policy. And I agree with you that the policy itself addresses the terminology issues that Bob brought up. It addresses the flexibility issues, and I think it's very well crafted.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposition? All right, thanks very much, David. You might as well stay there because I think you're doing item 10 as well.
Right.
Our update on voting shares.
Yeah, so this is an information item only. As you may be aware, our JPA agreement sets out the manner in which board members are able to vote and the weighting of their votes. And that weighting is determined in part by the electric usage in their respective communities. So to know what the voting shares are, we need to know what the electric usage is in those different areas. We get that information annually from PG&E. This year it's late, so our JPA agreement requires that by no later than March the 1st, we have to have updated information and update those voting shares. We don't have that information. We consulted our legal counsel, who advised us that it would, under the circumstances, be acceptable to postpone until such time as MCE receives that information from CPUC, and we can update the information accordingly. This is all, I think, this becomes relevant in a situation where there is a contested vote, and that doesn't happen very often at MCE. So I think just to sort of provide some context.
Do we have an expectation of when we might get the data we need?
Yeah, we expect to have the data by June or July at the latest.
Okay.
And one other thing I want to clarify is that this is the data lag from PG&E is really only an issue when we have new communities that we haven't served for a complete calendar year. And that is the case for 2015 because we had several communities that came in midway through. So we are relying on PG&E for data in the early months of the year. Going forward, if we weren't to expand during the course of a year, we would not be needing to wait for PG&E. We'd be using our own usage data. So if this continues to be an issue in future years, we may want to consider a JPA amendment, but at this time, our council didn't think it was necessary.
Thank you. Any questions for Dawn? All right, this is discussion only, so. All right. So, thank you, David. So now we're on regulatory and legislative updates. I know you're going to be really quick, huh?
I actually minimized the number of words per slide just having looked at the agenda.
All righty.
So I'll go through this as quickly as possible. Okay. Where am I pointing? Right there. Okay. I'll just touch base first on the power charging difference adjustment, or PCIA. We've discussed this extensively today. These are the fees that are charged by PG&E to our customers. So if you remember at the end of last year, a decision was voted out that essentially doubled the PCIA charge to our customers. Within that decision, however, the commission, the CPUC, committed to hosting a workshop. That workshop is going to be held on March 8th. In advance of that workshop, Energy Division from the CPUC issued a set of questions surrounding the PCIA and what our recommendations for reform are. That was due this week, so it was not included in your packet for this month, but you'll be able to see it in next month's packet. But just to give you a sense of what the gist of our proposed solutions, I mean, this was about 40 pages worth of solutions, is basically to increase transparency, to make sure that PG&E has a tendency to heavily redact information that would help us to better understand the cost drivers and what the PCIA is going to look like in the future. So what we want to see is more disclosure of non-confidential information and determining, okay, where can we disclose more so that we have greater insight into this charge. Another solution is to exclude avoidable costs. So what's intended here is the PCIA should capture only unavoidable costs of PG&E. That's what's in the statute. I think the challenge here has been, for years, PG&E has not made projections about CCA departing load, which means that additional costs were stranded that shouldn't have been. And then there's other areas where PG&E may have the ability to avoid costs but hasn't been incentivized to do so.
Beth, can I ask you a question? Is it clear what confidential information is? I know that we get redacted information, so PG&E, I'm assuming, is taking the position that a lot more information is confidential than we believe is confidential. Is there some place to turn where it's clear on what's confidential and what's not?
Yeah, there is. So the confidentiality rules of the CPUC are currently being revisited. We didn't find that a high enough value area to engage in. I'll dive into a couple of different sub-solutions here so that there's a little bit more clarity. Basically, what they don't want is they don't want market participants to have commercially sensitive data, load projections, things like that. A couple of alternatives that we've come up with are to bake in some additional non-confidential information. So there's a form called FERC Form 1, and that's disclosures to the federal government about actual power costs. So how can we use those to better get a grasp on PCIA costs? It's not exactly apples to apples, but it would be an improvement. Another example is to make an exception in the confidentiality rules for CCAs or folks in our position, since we're not trying to, we're not competing for contracts with PG&E, that level of sensitivity really isn't applicable to us. So we may be able to get information that way, and if we get that exception, then we would be able to get full suite of confidential information, which we would maintain its confidentiality, but that would give us a better glimpse into costs in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Complicated answer, but.
Okay.
Another one is to limit the duration of the PCIA. Right now, PCIA can extend for the life of renewables contracts. That was really intended to support the jump-starting of the renewables sector. But now that's a pretty matured space, and there really isn't a need to have a 25-year cost recovery period from departing load for that. 10 years, which is what their long-term procurement planning horizon is sufficient. And there's other ways that we can take a look at the duration of contracts and other resources. Limiting PCI volatility. This is methodological fixes that will smooth out the PCI a little bit more, so you don't end up with a doubling this year or other. We really don't know what next year will look like, and that makes planning difficult. It really doesn't benefit anybody. So, and then another set of solutions that we offered are alternative PCIA calculations. And so one of the ideas here is, okay, let's take a look at the net present value. PG&E, you project out the net present value of these PCIA charges. Come up with a number and you amortize it over a period of time, and it's just a flat per kWh fee. Gives them the money that they're expecting, and it gives us certainties for rate design and future planning purposes. So
wouldn't our argument against that be that they don't know how many new PCIAs how many new CCAs are going to be, so how could they know?
Yeah,
how to
so
make-
the way that this actually would work is it's done with the party municipal load, and so it's based upon, there's these things called vintages. So the year in which you leave is called your vintage. And so we have a very fine wine or aging. When municipal load departs, they end up with a negotiated settlement on what the exit fees are for that load departure, and you just sort of settle it up on the departure of that load. And we're looking for the same concept. Instead of revisiting it every single year and fighting over it every single year, come up with an appropriate methodology to allocate costs between CCAs and bundled customers, determine what's fair, project it out, amortize it, and call it a day, and we don't have to fight over it every year.
Would our vintages also be averaged within our own communities, or we're going to have communities that will be potentially entering in now, and communities have been there in the system for 5 years?
Yeah, well, within to be determined. I mean, I think this is, speculative, what direction we might go in. Right now, folks in our service territory have different vintages depending on when their community enrolled. So it may end up that certain communities have different vintages and different, levelized PCIA costs. But I think there's a lot of ways to skin that cat. Next slide, thanks. And just as a reminder, these were advocates who came before the CPUC in December that were just so passionate. And we had over 50 people come up and talk specifically on PCIA. For MCE alone in 2016, I think it's about $36 million that's going to be paid to PG&E. So, people have reason to be upset about this charge, and I think that now that there's enough CCA customers, the Public Utilities Commission really has to pay attention to that. So, yes.
Kevin Harrell from Larkspur. I mean, on that point, what opportunities are there for public participation at the March 8 workshop?
Right. So it's a public workshop.
Yeah.
And so it's in the Commission's daily calendar. So it's open to the public, and folks can participate. There is going to be an agenda, and so there's going to be allotted speaking and presentation times. And so MCE is going to have, basically all of the CCAs have a single presentation time, and we're going to be sharing the stage with Sonoma Clean Power, Jeff Cypress of Sonoma Clean Power, and then Jeremy from our office will be taking the technical lead. He's our senior regulatory analyst.
And just to follow on, would it be a benefit for MCE board members to attend the meeting? I'm actually hoping to. I've got it on my calendar.
You would be very welcome to attend.
And if there's a more formal role that
Yes.
members of the boards can play, that would be helpful feedback.
Yeah, let's discuss offline on that. That'd be really very helpful to have that perspective there. It is also, just so you know, from 10 to 3, so it's a long day, but we will have an allotted time.
We all have phones and emails, so.
Yeah, yeah, and there's Wi-Fi. A little bit slow there, but there is Wi-Fi. The next thing I want to touch on is energy efficiency. Next slide. So one of the things that we have done in the past month is a petition for modification of an earlier decision that approved our existing 2015 program budgets. Basically what we've asked for is an increase in funding by 30% on an annual basis. And that's just intended to reflect that we're now serving more communities. And so this is a proportional increase, proportionate to our increase in customer base. So that request is outstanding, and there isn't as clear of a timeline as there could be for resolution on that. But recently that proceeding has been assigned to a new administrative law judge who tends to deal with issues quite swiftly. And then just another note is just on energy storage. There was a decision that made a change in our favor at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year, that related to how storage is calculated, what counts towards our storage targets. Basically, there are storage projects that are funded through something called SGIP. That's the Small Generation Incentive Program. And all of those projects were going to be attributed to the investor-owned utilities. Well, we have done significant legwork in helping to facilitate the installation of a major storage project that does use SGIP funds, but without our efforts, it wouldn't have come into being. And so we petitioned the commission for a change in how the methodology works. And now, they didn't take our approach exactly, but they did say that a 50% of all SGIP funded projects would be attributed to, if it's in our service territory, to the CCA. And so that was a major, a very significant change to that decision that really does reflect our efforts towards bringing storage and new technologies online. So, and that wraps it up for my presentation.
Great, thanks, Beth. Any questions for Beth? No, seeing none. Thank you. Thank you, Beth. All right, any board members, staff matters?
We do have one
Yes?
staff matter.
All right.
I just wanted to thank those of you who participated in the Cool California Challenge. There were many participants here from the board, and some of you went so far as to get onto a videotape and be featured as one of the proponents of Cool California. And we're going to play one of those really quickly as a
cool.
closing.
Great.
We have Director Haroff, who's been featured in one of these.
I have to go. Hi, I'm Vice Mayor Kevin Haroff from Larkspur, California, home of the final scenes of Dirty Harry. Now, Larkspur, if you're asking yourself, do I feel lucky? You should, because right now our city is in the midst of a battle to win the title of coolest city in California. It's all part of the Cool California Challenge. All Larkspur has to do to win is save more energy than 21 other cities. The city that saves the most energy also wins the most cash to go toward a sustainability project for their city. Now, I'm not one of those elected officials that asks their residents to do something without pitching in myself. So I will personally come to your home and yell at your children to close doors, turn off lights, unplug video games, and to stop running water when they're brushing their teeth. As an added bonus, I can also shout at them to pick up after themselves, eat their vegetables, and to turn that darn racket down. Whatever needs to be done to push Larkspur to victory. You can do your part by going to cachallenge.org, signing up, and saving energy today. Thank you.
Wow, what a rock star. That was fabulous. That's great. Oh, boy, we are adjourned. Fantastic.